The morning of May 1st, 1942, dawned over Tokyo Bay with a deceptive calm. Inside the Naval War College at Meguro, Japan's most brilliant tactical minds gathered around a sprawling game board that represented the entire Pacific theater. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, architect of Pearl Harbor and commander of the combined fleet, watched in silence as dice tumbled across polished wood. The clatter echoed through the hall like distant gunfire. The results stopped conversations mid. According to the dice and the mathematical models painstakingly constructed by staff officers, 4 Japanese aircraft carriers would sink during the upcoming operation against Midway Island War College exercise records. Imperial Japanese Navy, May 1942. The room fell silent. Then Captain Kanji Ogawa, chief umpire of the war game, did something that would haunt Japanese naval aviation for generations. He reached across the table, altered the dice results, and resurrected 2 of the sunken carriers with a stroke of his pen. Post-war interrogation of Captain Kanji Ogawa, USSBs, October 1945. The war game continued under revised rules, Carrier Division 1 and Carrier Division 2. He erased from their mathematical graves, steamed forward on the board to deliver a crushing victory against the American fleet. Officers nodded approvingly. Sake was poured. The Kido Butai, Japan's elite carrier strike force, would surely triumph as it had at Pearl Harbor, as it had across the South Pacific, as destiny demanded. But the dice had spoken truth. 33 days later, in the blue waters northwest of Midway Atoll, 4 Japanese fleet carriers, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu would lie shattered on the ocean floor, exactly as the unaltered mathematics had predicted. U.S. Naval War College analysis. Battle of Midway after-action compilation, July 1942. The men who rigged the game would watch their empire begin its collapse in flames and smoke, victims of their own refusal to accept uncomfortable reality. This was not mere coincidence. This was the inevitable collision between wishful thinking and the cold mathematics of industrial war. By the spring of 1942, Japan's strategic position was already more precarious than Tokyo's war planners dared admit. The Pearl Harbor strike had been tactically brilliant, but strategically incomplete. No American carriers had been present that December morning, and the fuel tank farms and repair facilities that sustained Pacific Fleet operations remained untouched. Pearl Harbor Attack Hearings, Part 15, 1946. 6 months of conquest across Southeast Asia and the Pacific Islands had stretched Japanese supply lines to the breaking point. The Imperial Japanese Navy operated 10 fleet carriers and 6 light carriers against an American industrial base that had begun converting automobile factories and shipyards into the largest naval construction program in human history. U.S. Maritime Commission Production Reports, 1942 to 1945. At the Yokosuka Naval Arsenal and Kuri Naval Dockyards, Japanese engineers worked 8 shifts maintaining a carrier force that could not be rapidly replaced. Across the Pacific, in places like Newport News Shipbuilding and the Philadelphia Navy Yard, American workers were laying keels for Essex-class carriers at a rate Japan could never match, one every 3 months. By 1943, Bureau of Ships Construction records 1942 to 1944. The Midway War Game revealed this asymmetry in brutal clarity, but only for those willing to see. The exercise, conducted from April 28 to May 4, 1942, involved over 700 officers and utilized the most sophisticated operational research methods available to the Imperial Navy. Staff officers had calculated fuel consumption rates, aircraft sortie numbers, expected American defensive capabilities, and probable casualty ratios based on combat data from 6 months of war. Midway, Sensoi Sheet. Japanese Naval Staff History, Volume 43. The game board stretched 40 feet across, with miniature ship models positioned according to reconnaissance estimates and movement calculations. Each dice roll represented the chaos factor: weather, mechanical failure, human error. The fog of war that Clausewitz had identified a century earlier. When those dice indicated catastrophic carrier losses, they were incorporating variables Japanese commanders found politically unacceptable: that American fighters might be better coordinated, that U.S. carriers might strike first, that Japanese reconnaissance might fail at a critical moment, that most democratic of military forces might favor the enemy. Captain Ogawa's decision to override the mathematics was not made in isolation. The pressure came from above, from staff officers who had already committed to the Midway operation, from a command culture that valued fighting spirit over statistical analysis, from an institutional arrogance built on 6 months of unbroken victory. Nav No. 13. Captain Yasuji Watanabe, October 1945. Japan had conquered Hong Kong, Singapore, the Philippines, Java, and Burma with seemingly effortless superiority. The Kaido Butai had raided Ceylon and driven the Royal Navy's Eastern Fleet into panicked retreat. Zero fighters ruled Pacific skies. With kill ratios approaching 12-1 in early 1942, Japanese Naval Air Technical Arsenal Combat Reports, January-April 1942, to suggest that this unstoppable force would suffer a devastating defeat, that American pilots flying inferior Wildcats and obsolete Devastators could sink for fleet carriers in a single day seemed not just pessimistic but treasonous, so the dice were ignored. The carriers were refloated on paper. The game concluded with a Japanese victory, and planning proceeded toward the real operation with confidence intact and wisdom. Discarded. But mathematics does not negotiate. Probability does not bow to wishful thinking. The wargame had exposed fundamental vulnerabilities in Japanese doctrine. Carrier groups operating too close together, inadequate combat air patrol procedures, delayed damage control responses, insufficient reconnaissance assets, and overconfidence in visual sighting methods, technical analysis. IJN Carrier Operations, U.S. Naval Technical Mission to Japan, 1945 to 1946. Every one of these weaknesses would manifest fatally at Midway. The dice had modeled reality with startling accuracy because the staff officers constructing the game, before political pressure intervened, had built their calculations on hard data from previous battles. They had accounted for American industrial capacity, for improving U.S. tactical coordination, for the mathematical reality that Japan's 12-carrier force could not simultaneously support operations across a Pacific Ocean spanning 9,000 miles, while also defending the home islands and replacing combat losses. The Americans, meanwhile, were playing their own game with very different rules. At Pearl Harbor's basement headquarters, Admiral Chester Nimitz and his intelligence staff, led by Commander Joseph Rochefort, were reading Japanese naval codes with increasing clarity. Security classification removed. Sink Pack Command Summary, May 1942. They knew Midway was the target. They knew the approximate timing. They knew the composition of Yamamoto's strike force. And they knew something Japanese commanders had refused to accept, even when their own wargame showed them the truth. That, in modern naval warfare, decide with better information, better coordination, and the willingness to accept mathematical reality would prevail regardless of fighting spirit or cultural superiority. The dice had predicted Japan's defeat with eerie precision, but hubris had rewritten the results. Now the Imperial Navy steamed toward Midway, carrying not just aircraft and ordnance, but the weight of its own manufactured delusion. What happened next would prove that some truths cannot be altered, and some prices must be paid in full. The secret advantage that would doom Japan's carriers began not in a dramatic moment of tactical brilliance, but in a cramped basement beneath the 14th Naval District headquarters at Pearl Harbor. Commander Joseph John Rochefort, a rumpled officer who often worked in a smoking jacket and slippers, presided over Station Hippoas Signals Intelligence Unit that had achieved what Japanese planners considered impossible security declassified report. OP to OG Historical Review, 1946. By mid-May 1942, Rochefort's team of cryptanalysts and traffic analysts had penetrated deep into the Imperial Navy's JN-25 code, the operational cipher protecting Japanese fleet communications. They could not read every message perfectly. Some symbols remained opaque, some tactical details unclear, but they could read enough to know that AF in intercepted transmissions meant Midway, enough to know the attack date, early June, enough to know that Yamamoto was committing 4 fleet carriers, 2 light carriers, 11 battleships, 16 cruisers, and 46 destroyers to an operation predicated entirely on surprise sink-pack intelligence bulletin. May 28, 1942. The Japanese had assumed American code-breaking was primitive, perhaps capable of tactical intercepts, but incapable of strategic penetration. This assumption rested on cultural arrogance. Western minds supposedly lacked the subtle complexity to master. Japanese communication methods under sheer mathematical difficulty of the JN25 system, which utilized a codebook of approximately 45,000 five-digit groups, overlaid with additive ciphers that changed periodically. NSA Historical Monograph, Japanese Naval Codes, declassified 2008. What Tokyo failed to account for was American industrial-scale intelligence work. Station HYP employed not dozens, but hundreds of personnel working 3-shift rotations, processing thousands of intercepted messages daily, using IBM punch-card tabulators to identify patterns and frequency distributions that human analysts alone could never detect. Technical report, IBM Cryptoanalytic Equipment, Naval Security Group, 1943, at stations across the Pacific Corridor before its fall, Melbourne, Dutch Harbour, and intercept sites along the West Coast. Radio operators logged every Japanese transmission, building the statistical database that made code-breaking possible. The man-hours invested dwarfed anything Japan's smaller, more traditional intelligence apparatus could match, where Japanese naval intelligence relied on individual brilliance and institutional memory. America applied assembly line methodology: systematize, distribute, calculate, verify, repeat. Rochefort's breakthrough came with confirmation, not guesswork. When doubters at naval intelligence in Washington questioned whether AF truly designated Midway, Rochefort devised an elegant proof. He had Midway's garrison transmit an uncoded message reporting that their freshwater distillation plant had broken down. 2 days later, Station HYPO intercepted a Japanese message reporting that AF was short of freshwater commander Jasper Holmes. Double-edged secrets, 1979. The trap confirmed what traffic analysis had already suggested. Admiral Nimitz, trusting Rochefort over more senior intelligence officers in Washington, committed his entire available carrier force, Enterprise, Hornet, and the hastily repaired Yorktown to ambush positions northeast of Midway. Sinkpak War Diary, May 26–28, 1942. The Americans would know where the Japanese were. The Japanese would have no idea the Americans were there. In carrier warfare, where the first strike often proved decisive, this information asymmetry was equivalent to fighting with a loaded gun against an enemy still drawing his weapon. The Japanese sailed into this ambush, carrying institutional blindness like ballast. Admiral Keiichi Nagumo, commanding the Kyoto Butai from the carrier Akagi, operated under doctrine that emphasized aggressive action over careful reconnaissance. His search plan for the morning of June 4, 1942, featured 7 floatplanes covering a 240-degree arc ahead of the strike, force a pattern that left dangerous gaps and committed aircraft with limited endurance. Action report. 1st Air Fleet, June 15, 1942, translated USS. One of those floatplanes, launched 30 minutes late from the cruiser tone due to catapult malfunction, would fly the critical southern search leg that should have detected the American carrier's interrogation. NAVNO. Captain Tamatsu Oishi, November 1945. That 30-minute delay, a mechanical failure compounded by inadequate maintenance procedures, gave the Americans undetected positioning during the war's most critical hours. Japanese carriers could launch and recover aircraft faster than their American counterparts. The Akagi's crew could complete a full strike launch in 15 minutes versus 34. Us carriers, but speed meant nothing when the enemy already knew your location and you remained blind to his. Comparative Aircraft Carrier Operations Study, U.S. Naval War College, 1947. At 0430 hours on June 4, Nagumo launched 108 aircraft toward Midway Island, 36 Kate bombers carrying 800-kilogram bombs, 36 Val dive bombers, and 36 Zero fighters. 1st Air Fleet attack plan. June 4, 1942. The strike left his for carriers Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu with reduced combat air patrol coverage and full deck parks of reserve aircraft being armed for a potential second wave. Japanese doctrine called for holding this reserve to strike enemy carriers if they appeared, but Nagumo believed no American flat tops were within 500 miles. His intelligence said so. His reconnaissance showed nothing. At 0700 hours, the Midway strike commander radioed that a second attack was necessary to suppress the island's defenses. Radio intercept log. Station Hypo, June 4, 1942. Nagumo made the fatal decision: rearm the reserve aircraft with land attack ordnance. On the hangar decks of 4 carriers, exhausted ordnancemen began removing armor-piercing bombs and aerial torpedoes, replacing them with fragmentation bombs and The weapons change created chaos torpedoes stacked along bulkheads, bomb carts crowding passageways, aviation fuel lines connected for refueling, ammunition staging areas overflowing. Damage control report. IJN Akagi, reconstructed from survivor testimony, November 1945, at 07 to 8 hours. The delayed floatplane from Tone finally reported what Nagumo dreaded. Enemy surface ships sighted. At 0809, a correction. The enemy force included what appeared to be a carrier-first air fleet radiolog. June 4, 1942. Nagumo now faced the nightmare scenario his wargame had predicted and his staff had dismissed. American carriers were present, positioned to strike, and his own carriers were caught in the worst possible configuration. Flight decks crowded with returning Midway strike aircraft low on fuel. Hangar decks littered with bombs and torpedoes being frantically re-exchanged. An insufficient time to clear, rearm, launch, and defend before the Americans attacked. Dramatized composite from multiple survivor accounts. The ordnance officers were screaming for more time. The pilots were screaming for permission to land. The fighter directors were screaming that radar showed incoming contacts. And the Admiral was screaming for everyone to work faster. As if human will could overcome physics and time. Compiled from Interrogation Navno 85. Lieutenant Joichi, an Interrogation Navno 47, Lieutenant Zenji Abe, October 1945. The Americans struck in uncoordinated waves that should have been disastrous but instead proved devastatingly effective through sheer persistence and sacrificial courage. Torpedo Squadron 8, flying obsolete TBD Devastators from Hornet, attacked at 09 to 0 hours without fighter escort and was annihilated. 15 aircraft shot down. Only one pilot survived. Action report. USS Hornet, June 13, 1942. Torpedo 6 and Torpedo 3 followed, suffering similar casualties. Not a single torpedo hit scored, but those doomed attacks drew Japanese combat air patrol down to sea level, leaving the high-altitude approach lanes undefended. At 10:22 hours, dive bombers from Enterprise and Yorktown 37 SBD, Dauntless is led by Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey, rolled into their attack dives from 14,000 feet. Against carriers that were essentially undefended. Action report. Bombing Squadron 6, June 8, 1942. The mathematical precision the wargame had predicted now manifested in fire and explosion. Akagi took one bomb hit that detonated amid the rearming chaos on her hangar deck, triggering sympathetic explosions that turned Japan's finest carrier into an inferno. Within minutes, technical analysis of Japanese carrier losses. Bureau of Ships, August 1942, Kaga absorbed for direct hits, her flight deck erupting as aviation fuel ignited. Soryu took 3 bombs in rapid succession, her crew abandoning ship within 20 minutes as uncontrollable fires consumed her from within. In 5 minutes, Nagumo had lost 3/4 of his strike power. The 4th carrier, Hiryu, operating separately, launched a counterstrike that crippled Yorktown, but could not reverse the mathematical reality that the dice had forecast 2 months earlier. Action report. USS Yorktown, June 18, 1942. By 1700 hours, American dive bombers found Hiryu and delivered the same devastating precision for bomb hits. Fires spreading, structural collapse inevitable. By sunset on June 4, 1942, all 4 Japanese fleet carriers were dead or dying, their wreckage slipping toward the ocean floor, carrying with them 3,057 men, 248 aircraft, and the offensive capability. Japan could never rebuild Japanese carrier losses. USSB's final report. Pacific War, 1946. The Americans lost Yorktown and destroyer Hammond, painful but replaceable. The asymmetry was crushing. The wargame's unaltered The strategic earthquake that began at Midway reverberated through every subsequent campaign in the Pacific, with mathematical inevitability. Japan's carrier aviation, which had opened the war with approximately 3,500 highly trained naval aviators, men who had spent years mastering their craft, lost 110 irreplaceable pilots and aircrew at Midway. But more critically, lost the 4 fleet carriers that formed the backbone of offensive operations. Japanese Naval Aviation Analysis, USSBs, 1946. The Imperial Navy could theoretically build replacement carriers, given enough time and resources, but time was the one commodity Japan's industrial base could not manufacture. At Kure Naval Arsenal and Yokozuka Dockyard, engineers faced a brutal calculus. Constructing a single fleet carrier required approximately 24 months from keylaying to commissioning, consumed 45,000 tons of steel, and demanded specialized labor that Japan's shrinking resource base could barely sustain. Japanese shipbuilding production records. Technical Mission to Japan Report, 1946. Meanwhile, across the Pacific, American shipyards were completing Essex-class carriers every 90 days by late 1943, each one larger, faster, and more capable than the ships burning on the Midway seabed. The naval balance that Japan had desperately tried to maintain through tactical brilliance was now shifting, through industrial momentum that no amount of courage or cunning could reverse. The psychological impact proved equally devastating. Japanese naval aviators who survived Midway carried the trauma of watching invincible carriers transformed into funeral pyres in minutes. Dramatized composite from multiple post-war interrogations. We had been taught that our spirits were stronger, that our training was superior, that the Americans were soft and their equipment inferior. Then we watched 3 carriers explode in 5 minutes. How do you maintain faith in spiritual superiority when mathematics and explosives demonstrate otherwise? Compiled from Interrogation Nav No. 73, Lieutenant Toshio Hashimoto, and Interrogation Nav No. 91, Petty Officer Juzo Mori, December 1945. The confidence that had propelled Japanese forces across the Pacific for 6 months evaporated in the smoke over Midway Atoll. Conversely, American morale soared with tangible proof that Japanese forces were not invincible, that American intelligence and tactics could overcome initial disadvantages, that industrial production and systematic analysis could defeat an enemy that had seemed unstoppable. Pilots who had flown obsolete aircraft into suicidal torpedo runs and, the few who survived became instant legends, their sacrifice validating the larger strategic approach that subordinated individual heroism to systematic, information-driven warfare. Morale and psychological assessment. Pacific Fleet personnel. July 1942. The campaign advantages that flowed from Midway's intelligence triumph extended far beyond a single battle. Station HYPO and its counterparts continued penetrating Japanese naval communications throughout 1942 and 1943, providing Admiral Nimitz with strategic intelligence that shaped every major operation. When Japan attempted to reinforce Guadalcanal in August 1942, American codebreakers provided advance warning of convoy movements and carrier positions. SyncPack intelligence summaries. August-November 1942, when Admiral Yamamoto himself toured forward bases in April 1943, Station HYPO intercepted his itinerary with such precision that Army Air Force P-38 Lightnings could execute a 400-mile intercept over Buke, killing Japan's most capable naval strategist exactly on schedule. Mission report. 339th Fighter Squadron, April 18, 1943. The systematic exploitation of communications, intelligence and advantage. Japan's wargame culture had been institutionally incapable of modeling or accepting turned every subsequent operation into an ambush where American forces knew Japanese intentions while Tokyo remained perpetually surprised by U.S. movements and strength. The logistics and maintenance advantages that American industrial culture provided compounded over months into an insurmountable gap. Japanese carriers that survived Midway faced accelerating mechanical deterioration as overworked maintenance crews struggled with parts shortages and battle damage. The fleet carrier Shokaku required 4 months of repairs after the Battle of the Coral Sea and emerged with degraded aviation fuel systems and compromised watertight integrity. Kure Naval Arsenal repair records. May-September 1942. American carriers, even when severely damaged, returned to action with remarkable speed. Yorktown, crippled at Coral Sea in May 1942, underwent repairs at Pearl Harbor. That should have required 3 months but was completed in 72 hours through round-the-clock work by 1,400 shipyard workers who understood that every day counted. Pearl Harbor Navy Yard Work Report, May 27 to 29, 1942, when Yorktown finally sank at Midway, she had already contributed crucial strike power that helped destroy 3 new Japanese carriers, a testament to American maintenance, the philosophy that prioritized rapid functional repair over perfect restoration. This same philosophy extended across the Pacific Fleet. Damaged ships were patched and returned to battle while Japanese vessels sat in dockyards waiting for proper parts and artisan-quality repairs that supply chains could no longer deliver. Human cost of Japan's refusal to accept mathematical reality accumulated. In Pacific waters and jungle islands across 3 more years of increasingly desperate fighting, the combined fleet would never again achieve the concentrated striking power it possessed. On June 3, 1942, subsequent carrier battles at Eastern Solomons, Santa Cruz, and the Philippine Sea saw Japanese aviation quality decline steadily as veteran pilots died and training programs shortened under resource constraints. Japanese Naval Aviation Training Analysis, Technical Air Intelligence Center, 1945. By mid-1944, Japanese carrier aircraft were being flown by pilots with less than 100 hours of flight time against American aviators averaging 300 hours, a skill gap that translated directly into lopsided kill ratios and one-sided battles. The engineers and technicians who had maintained Japan's pre-war carrier forcemen, whose expertise took years to develop, died at Midway, drowned in Coral Sea, perished at Santa Cruz, and could not be rapidly replaced. American maintenance crews, trained in systematic troubleshooting procedures developed by General Electric, Pratt & Whitney, and Douglas Aircraft, kept aging airframes flying through standardized repair protocols and abundant spare parts logistics that Japanese supply chains could never match. Comparative Maintenance Efficiency Study. Naval Air Technical Training Command, 1944. The strategic paralysis that gripped Japanese planning after Midway stemmed directly from the war. Game culture that had prioritized desired outcomes over probable realities. When staff officers proposed operations, the shadow of Midway hung over every calculation. What if American intelligence already knows? What if our reconnaissance fails again? What if the mathematical models predict disaster and we ignore them only to watch prophecy fulfilled? The confident aggression that characterized early 1942 operations gave way to defensive hesitation, reactive deployments, and increasingly desperate gambles like the Philippine Sea Turkey shoot, where Japan lost 600 aircraft in a single day attempting to recreate Midway-style decisive battle conditions that no longer existed. Action Report. Fast Carrier Task Force, Philippine Sea, June 1944. American planning, meanwhile, embraced the systematic analysis that Rochefort and his codebreakers represented. Operations research teams, mathematicians, and engineers recruited from universities and corporations analyzed everything from optimal torpedo depth settings to aircraft carrier deck cycle efficiency to anti-aircraft gunnery effectiveness. The U.S. Navy institutionalized the lesson Japan had rejected, that mathematical models revealing uncomfortable truths were more valuable than comforting assumptions, that dice predicting defeat deserved investigation rather than alteration. That systematic analysis outweighed fighting spirit in industrial-age warfare operations research applications. Pacific Fleet, 1942 to 1945. Naval War College Study, 1948. The legacy of Japan's rigged wargame extended far beyond 1945, shaping Cold War doctrine and modern military planning in ways that strategists still study. The Soviet Union, observing how American signals intelligence and operations research contributed to Pacific victory, invested heavily in similar capabilities, cryptanalysis, traffic analysis, systematic modeling that would characterize superpower competition for decades. CIA Historical Review. Soviet Naval Intelligence Capabilities, Declassified, 1995. The U.S. Navy's post-war carrier doctrine incorporated Midway's lessons about information dominance, damage control procedures, and the fatal consequences of overconfidence into training curricula that persist today. Modern naval officers study Nagumo's decision-making as a cautionary tale about confirmation bias, institutional pressure to produce desired conclusions, and the catastrophic costs of ignoring systematic analysis when it contradicts preferred narratives. The wargame that predicted 4 carrier losses then had those losses erased by staff officers unwilling to accept unwelcome Mathematics became a defining case study in military education worldwide, a perfect illustration of how organizational culture can doom even the most tactically proficient force when that culture values face-saving